And we're back in the studio. Joining us now is James Kirchick, Foreign Policy Initiative Fellow and Daily Beast contributor. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. Actually, one of your latest pieces in the Daily Beast, this is what we would like to start with, your article about World Russia Forum. And the question will be, who are Russia's public supporters in the West, if we start with that?
Well, they don't have that many, actually. Certainly not as much as they did, I would say, during the Cold War. If you look at this the World Russia Forum, I'd say the highest profile person to appear would be Dana Rohrabacher, who's a Republican congressman from California. And it's quite ironic because he used to be a real Reaganite Cold Warrior. He actually fought with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. But since then, he's taken somewhat of a turn where I think he now sees basically Islam or Islamism as being the great struggle of our time, and he sees Russia as being an ally in that fight, and so he's taken a very sort of pro-Russia, pro-Putin stance, and thinks that this whole business over Ukraine is just sort of a nuisance getting in the way of some sort of great alliance between Moscow and Washington. The other big figure, although he's not so big, is Stephen Cohen, who I'm sure you're quite familiar with.
Well, and you history professor, but I mean, what I thought was very interesting about this piece is looking at one particular conference, not only looking how it had changed over the years, but this ability of Russia to, unify basically the right and the old left, to bring them together, which would seem like a complete contradiction.
Yes, and it's actually interesting. I went to another conference this week at the Wilson Center, which is a federally funded think tank in Washington, and it was celebrating the 70th anniversary of World War II, but with a particular emphasis on the Soviet role in this. And so basically what the message was, it was the Soviet Red Army that won World War II. They suffered 20 times more losses than did the Anglo-American side of the tripartite alliance. And the subtle message of this conference was basically, you know what, America and Russia were great allies in World War II. We defeated fascism on the European continent. Let's be friends again. Why are we fighting over this?
Well, actually,
stupid little
World
thing?
War II is one of the most sensitive topics for Russia right now. We can see how sensitive Putin is on, for example, who is joining the parade in Moscow, who is not, how the history is told. But my question would be, if we look into the idea that Russia is exporting, what's the idea actually? What are they, so to say, selling to the West? That the West is not anymore, that if we talk about that idea, if there is one.
Yeah, I think I don't like to use the word propaganda with what they're doing, because propaganda is, it's Victory Day marches, it's extolling the virtues of a particular system, which is communism. You don't see that. There isn't much about Russia on RT or Sputnik. They don't talk much about Russia and how great Russia is and how great Putin is. There's actually very little discussion of what's happening in Russia. It's mostly negative reports on, obviously, Ukraine is the #1 target, how it's a bunch of fascists and Nazis running around, but it's a general narrative of decline in the West, and these systems don't work. And you know what, maybe Putin, maybe he even is an authoritarian leader, but Obama's no better. And France is messed up. It's declining. Britain, they're all going to hell in a handbasket, and at least Russia is controlled and staying strong. That's not true, obviously, but that seems to be the general narrative and the message that they're sending. It's more one of negativity.
Maybe that's a hybrid propaganda. We have a hybrid war.
But I mean, it seems to combine two existing strategies, one of which in Russia in a lot of areas is to try and make Russia look stronger by weakening its enemies. So not necessarily making Russia stronger, but somehow weakening the position of those that are near it. But I think also, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about this, when it comes to that, RT, for example, is very good at appealing to certain smaller groups, conspiracy theorists or others. But part of that seems to be come for this view which isn't represented elsewhere, but then stay for the coverage about Ukraine, because Ukraine is often a terra incognita for many people in the West. So if they knew nothing about it, even if there's slightly more coverage on some of these channels than elsewhere, then they start to have this different idea of what Ukraine is.
I think it's actually a very smart analysis in that they do they'll throw anything against the wall and see what sticks. And so they're trying to appeal to this very broad portion of discontented, cynical people, which are frankly a large portion of them are young people who are under 30 who tend to be anti-authoritarian, perhaps more cynical about power. So they kind of pull them in with stories about UFOs and aliens and just the weird and wacky. There's a lot of weird and wacky stuff
But good TV.
But great TV, and yeah, absolutely. So they pull you in with the weird and wacky, and then it's, well, on a more serious note, did you know that there's this global banking conspiracy coming out of, Washington and the IMF and the whole rest of it?
That's a big part of it. It's, come for the UFOs, come
Right.
for whatever it is, and then stay for the version of Ukrainian events or Western events, and,
It's a mix of
the
high and low
narrative
brow,
comes.
actually, yeah.
How do you think this influence the way that the conflict in Ukraine is being informed? How do you think is it influencing conflict in Ukraine on the ground?
It's harder for me to say what's happening in Ukraine. I don't live here. I've only visited here a few times. I can tell you more about the effect it's having, I think, in Western Canada. I actually don't think it is going very far in the United States. I think anti-Russian attitudes in America are as high as they were at the worst point of the Cold War. So they don't seem to be penetrating very much beyond, Dana Rohrabacher on the right and the Nation magazine on the left. What I'm more worried about is how this narrative is playing in Europe. And I do think that there's a lot of potential for trouble in places like Germany, where you have already a great deal of sympathy towards Russia and skepticism towards Ukraine. And Germany is a country where the whole narrative of resurgent fascism can really be planted, because there's obviously a great deal of suspicion about the role the Ukrainians played in World War II.
And when we maybe look at the tools of, what could resolve this crisis going forward, it's really the Europeans who have the power there, because they have the economic power. I mean, that's where the energy goes. The U.S. can take a harder stance, in part because they don't have the economic interests in Russia that the Europeans do. But we've spoken a little bit about Russia. I mean, if we look back at Ukraine and we look at how they're dealing with the past and, their own positioning, how are they doing? Because there's this new law that was passed by the Rada that's now sitting on President Poroshenko's desk about banning, Nazi and communist symbols.
Yeah.
I mean, how is that perceived in the West? What's your take on that?
Well, if I could sit down with him and talk to him, I would tell him to absolutely veto this law. It reminds me of the law that was passed shortly after Yanukovych was overthrown that would have prohibited Russian from being a second language, which was vetoed by the then president at the time. I think this is the sort of thing that just completely plays into the hands of Ukraine's enemies.
But is that enough? I mean, when we look at this law,
I think it's wrong on the merits. Absolutely, I think it's wrong on the merits. I'm a free speech absolutist, and I think if Ukraine wants to be part of the West, if it wants to really embrace liberal values and become a democracy, then you don't put people in jail or fine them for things that they say. And that's what this law does.
But why? I mean, when you look at Germany or Austria, they have restrictions on swastikas and Nazi imagery. You look at a lot of former communist countries, they have restrictions on communist imagery.
It's true.
I mean, why? What's
this
different?
law goes further, and I believe it would outlaw sort of glorification of various. It would outlaw glorification of Nazi and communist regimes, but it would also outlaw anyone who disputed the heroic role that these various Ukrainian nationalist groups played. It's a package of laws, and so if you criticize Bandera, you could be punished. You can imagine how the Poles, who are Ukraine's greatest allies, would feel about something like that. So I think this law goes further, actually, than what's the case in other countries. And I also think, I think Germany is a. I'm not German. I'm not going to tell them what to do. I think Germany is a special case. If they want to pass a law banning these sorts of things with regard to their specific history, then that's their decision. It's not one I would make as an American. But I don't think it's fair or really correct to compare laws that are on the books in Germany with Ukraine. With Ukraine.
Why not? Why Ukraine is not a special case?
I don't think it's a special case at all. I think Germany is the special case, because Germany was a country where Nazism was born and then where that started World War II. So I think Germany is more the special case. I think actually some of these laws in the Baltics are quite controversial in that they seem to go, the way that these laws tend to be employed in the post-communist world is that they far more often go after positive expressions about communism than they do fascism or Nazism. So you'll see in the Baltic states there will be parades celebrating units that fought with the Waffen-SS, and those aren't banned. But if you tried to host some sort of communist demonstration, then you would be penalized. So I don't want to see Ukraine fall into that trap. I also just don't see the purpose of this law. I mean, countries fighting a war against Russia
Well,
right
I mean,
now.
you're not
Why are they
alone.
even doing this?
I mean, you're not alone. There's this prominent letter that has been sent by a number of academics to
yes.
President Poroshenko, also encouraging him to veto it,
Yeah.
seeing it as a limitation on, academic freedom, but also more generally, freedom of speech
Yeah.
and touching on these elements. So that is a major debate. But I mean, for many, there is also a sense in Ukraine, or some people that take the position this is overdue here, that this was done in a lot of Central European countries in the 90s, Ukraine wasn't able to, and you do have a lot of communist symbols or figures or representations that haven't been changed.
Well, I think if you really want to, if it wants to come to terms with its history, it should confront it. And I think the great aspect of this law is opening the archives, which is sort of unprecedented, I think, in a former, with the exception of obviously the Baltic
Well, and just
states,
to clarify,
but
opening the KGB archives,
KGB
donating
archives.
it to the Institute of Memory so that they'd be
that's
freely available to everyone.
that is a great, absolutely terrific move. And that's more what we should be talking about. And support should be given more for initiatives like that than, silly laws that tell you can't wear a red star in public. I don't see what good that does.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you
for
so
that
much.
take.